There are a number of different types of grief, and I just want to mention a few of them. We may well experience normal grief, and the American Psychological Society talks about normal grief usually lasting from between 6 months to 2 years if it's the loss of a significant other. Anticipatory grief is where we are grieving in advance of somebody's death. So, for example, somebody who has a diagnosis of dementia, I may well be grieving the loss of them before they've passed away. I may also have anticipatory grief if somebody is terminally unwell. Complicated grief is where I have a number of different experiences and conflicting emotions around the grief. So again, for example, if I had been in a relationship that was actually an unhealthy one and was quite abusive, when my abuser dies, I may have quite conflicted emotions over that person's death. Chronic grief is intense grief that goes on for a long period of time. And if somebody's experiencing chronic grief, they will need help from external professionals. So it's not necessarily just something they can get over by themselves. They'll need some extra support in there. Cumulative grief is exactly that. It's when we have a number of different experiences of grief, and they can be a range of different things, grieving for different reasons, but they build over time. So if we have several of those experiences in a short space of time, we will feel absolutely exhausted and overwhelmed. It's a tough thing to deal with at the best of times. So we saw quite a lot of this during the COVID epidemic, when people were not only grieving the loss of their old lifestyle and potentially being in lockdown and grieving the life that they had, but they were then potentially grieving relatives who became sick and died. So there were a range of different grief experiences all in a short space of time, which are incredibly difficult to deal with. Secondary loss is really common. So when somebody dies, we may well then lose the role that we had around them. So for example, if somebody's a carer, and somebody dies, then that you not only have lost the person, but you've lost your caring role. So you feel a different set of experiences. There's secondary loss on top of the immediate loss that you've experienced. People often experience this as well in a slightly different format when, for example, teenagers go off to university and someone's been a parent for a long period of time, and suddenly that person's not there anymore. And then what's my role? What's my raison d'etre? What's my reason to get up in the morning? Suddenly that can be very, very hard to experience and to go through. Traumatic grief is when we experience usually sudden loss, or for example, somebody dies in a car accident, we may be a survivor, and someone has died alongside us. So we then experience traumatic grief. Traumatic grief can also happen, for example, if somebody loses a child, something like an asthma attack. It's a shock, it's sudden, it's unexpected, and we end up experiencing trauma and traumatic grief as a result of that. Inhibited grief is where we bury it and we don't confront it. And sometimes that's a coping strategy. So again, there's not a right or wrong way to grieve. There are just lots of different ways that as humans we do, and we may experience a range of different emotions connected to that. Somebody with inhibited grief will very much not face it, spend a lot of time diverting themselves, doing other things, and in a way, it's how they're getting through it. So again, nothing's right or wrong, but there are different types of grief and different ways of grieving.